Okay, it's
I believe we are live. Welcome, everyone, to a panel discussion, one of a series of colloquia presentations on the current struggle over academic freedom and institutional autonomy in American higher education, sponsored by the Center for Studies in Higher Education at the University of California at Berkeley. The center has sponsored a number of briefings, panel discussions, dialogues, led by John Douglas, who's our colleague in the center, who's written a book on the international dimensions of the struggle over academic freedom. Just last month, we had a presentation by Henry Reichman, who's one of the authors of the scathing AAUP, Association of American University Professors on Florida. Today's conversation continues the dialogue that we are having in trying to understand the implications of a national struggle over academic freedom. We are co-sponsored today by the center, also by UC Berkeley's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and by the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies. Here's the agenda for today. We have 90 minutes. We will start with a presentation by Jeremy Young, who is the director, as I will introduce him, the director of the Freedom to Learn project at PEN America. We then go to Janella Butler, to Richard Gerasi, then myself. We may have some disagreements and dialogue between us. Then it's open for questions from all of you, and you can use the chat function to enter your questions. We do have some questions actually already. It is really a pleasure for me to welcome you all to a dialogue with friends and colleagues who have been real stalwarts in this struggle. Jeremy Young is the program director of PEN America's Freedom to Learn project. He's been leading the national PEN America response to censorship. He has a PhD in history from Indiana University. He's taught history at the university level. And he led the American Historical Association's Freedom to Learn initiative. This Freedom to Learn beat, Jeremy, has been yours for a while. Janella Butler is a professor emerita of women's studies and the former provost and vice president for academic affairs at Spelman College. She has her doctorate from UMass Amherst. She taught at the University of Washington in the American Ethnic Studies, with a professorship in English and Women's Studies, was earlier on the faculty of Towson State and Smith College. She has been on the faculty of the Executive Leadership Academy of the Center for Studies in Higher Education since 2012, I believe, Janella. Richard Gerasi, who has his doctorate in political science from Indiana University. I guess you and Jeremy both are Indiana University alums. He taught at St. Lawrence University, Hobart and William Smith, political economy, political theory. He is the president emeritus at Wagner College in Staten Island in New York, where he was their longest serving president, I think 19 years. Richard has a national reputation for the development of community collaboratives between universities, colleges, and local agencies and institutions. I'm Brian Murphy. I'm an associate at the Center for Studies of Higher Education at Berkeley. I was the president at De Anza College for a number of years. I have my doctorate from Berkeley and taught political theory at UC Santa Cruz, Santa Clara University, and San Francisco State before going to De Anza. So the protocol is first to turn it to you, Jeremy, for an overview. The topic today, to remind ourselves, is not simply, boy, you know, things are bad, and here's exactly how bad it is. But how do we fight back? How do we engage? This is an effort to explain and explicate to ourselves and engage you in the audience with the question of what might higher education do to be more responsive in this struggle over academic freedom. Jeremy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Brian, for the invitation. Thanks to the various groups at Berkeley for having this really important conversation. I've got about 15 minutes here, and I am actually going to start with a brief discussion of the problem and the sort of scope of it. But then we will turn, as Brian said, very quickly to the question of what can or should we do as higher education, as citizens, as Americans. So let me go ahead and share my screen. It'll just take a moment. And now I will full screen this. And there we go. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit, as Brian said, I am the program director of the Freedom to Learn program here at PEN America. Just a little bit of background on what PEN America is. We are a 100-year-old organization standing at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect free expression in the United States and worldwide. We have a number of programs, both domestic and international, to protect free expression, primarily focused on writers, but writers also including educators of all sorts. And our free expression and education programs focus specifically on the need for campuses and classrooms, both at the higher ed and the K-12 level, to become more equitable and inclusive, but to do so in a way that harmonizes with robust free expression protections. We have a few programs under these auspices. A campus free speech program, which includes a well-received campus free speech guide and a set of principles of campus free speech, a series of trainings that we offer on college campuses on free speech principles for administrators, faculty, staff, and students. We have a set of free expression advocacy institutes. These are aimed at high school and college students. We have a Freedom to Read program, probably our marquee program at the moment, which is combating book bans at the K-12 school level all around the country. And the Freedom to Learn program, which I lead, is our program responding to legislation and state-level legislation that goes after higher education and attempts to censor the teaching of race and gender and many other similar topics. In our program, we engage in legislative tracking and analysis. We have a legislative tracker updated every week of these bills. We have a series of reports that we put out once a year, a bunch of commentary. We also do a lot of media work, a lot of communication work, speaking to the press, writing op-eds, presenting all over the country at events like this to try to raise awareness of what's happening. And we do coalition building work. We work with a coalition of former college presidents, the champions of higher education, of whom we're proud to count both Brian and Richard as founding members. We have another coalition of higher ed associations that meet to discuss these issues, and we continue to work more and more closely in Florida and in other states to build state-level coalitions around these issues as well. So what issues are we talking about? Let me set the stage here. PEN America has coined this term educational gag orders, and increasingly this term does not fully describe what we're seeing at the state level, what kind of legislation we are seeing in these spaces. We coined this term to describe initially a set of bills also called divisive concepts or anti-critical race theory bills, which were state-level attempts to ban a series of so-called divisive concepts relating to race, gender, identity, and American history, banning them primarily from classroom settings, initially at the K-12 level, but very quickly moving into higher ed, and ultimately, I think, by this year, higher ed is now the primary target. These educational gag orders, have been a concern of PEN as a free expression organization because they impose content and viewpoint-based censorship on faculty members. They ban faculty members from discussing particular sets of ideas in their classes and only those ideas. They lead inevitably to two kinds of censorship beyond what the law even requires, both administrative censorship because the laws are vaguely written, and university administrators are, in many cases, are afraid that something even touching on these content areas might violate the law. It's unclear what does and doesn't. Also, self-censorship when faculty members or even students engage in censoring themselves, essentially doing the work of the censors for them because they're so afraid that they might be targeted for what they say in class. And finally, it's worth noting that these gag orders do specifically suppress the visibility and voices of Black and LGBTQ Americans, as well as some other specific groups. They are not, this is part of what, they are not just content and viewpoint based, but they are also specifically targeted at some of the most vulnerable groups in the country. These bills have been around for, we are going on 4 years here since the origin of the educational gag order crisis, or what we call the Ed Scare, which really grew out of a backlash in 2020 against the racial reckoning that seemed to be forming in this country around the George Floyd protests, the 1619 Project, and other materials. We saw an equity backlash, a deliberate set of attempts to use the term critical race theory, as many of you know, essentially a legal theory or a cultural studies theory around, how to interpret race in society, and to use that term as a catch-all term for educational practices related to DEI, or really for as Chris Rufo says in this set of tweets, for anything that particular voices on the right don't like related to education around race. In September 2020, President Trump issued an executive order called Combating and Race and Sex Stereotyping, which for the first time, introduced this series of divisive concepts and banned them from use in trainings in government agencies. This was not initially targeted at educational spaces. But when that executive order was first stayed by a court and then repealed in the Biden administration, these bills began to be introduced at the state level, targeted specifically toward educational institutions and classroom speech in particular. In 2021, we saw about just under 60 of these bills introduced. And then there was a massive escalation in 2022, over nearly 150 bills introduced around the country, many of them targeting K-12, but an increasing number focusing on higher education. Here's the map for higher ed. There is another map we have for K-12, which is even more colorful, because there have been even more states that have introduced or passed bills. At this point, 130 higher education gag order bills or policies or other types of educational censorship legislation. As we'll note in a moment, that this legislation is diverging from the educational gag order format, have been introduced in the last 4 legislative cycles. 34 states have had at least one of these bills or policies introduced. 49 additional bills that restrict higher education governance. These are, we'll talk about what this means in a moment, have been introduced. And at the moment, 12 educational gag order laws or policies are enforced in 12 states, with 17 laws or policies in 14 states restricting either gag orders or university governance. What are we talking about when it comes to governance issues? In 2023, there was a key pivot, in part, I think, because of the failure of the Stop Woke Act, the most prominent of the educational gag orders, to survive a court challenge in Florida. It was stayed and ultimately maybe struck down on the grounds that it's unconstitutional in a variety of ways, including First and 14th Amendment grounds. And in response to that, some of the folks pushing these bills pivoted away from direct restrictions on classroom speech, instead restricting the autonomy of university governance, restricting this in a few different ways. The most prominent has been banning universities from deciding to build or maintain a DEI office or initiative, diversity, equity, or inclusion programming or offices. But there have been further restrictions on university autonomy. Some of these have been restrictions on what kinds of courses can be offered in general education programs, what kinds of majors and minors can be offered. There have been attempts to ban everything from gender studies to African American studies to LGBTQ studies, just outright ban it under law from being taught in a college classroom or as a major or minor. attempts to rewrite universities' mission statements, including in Florida, where a law passed that allows political appointees to rewrite the mission statement of any public university in the state. Restrictions on shared governance, attempts to take away faculty role in the governance of the institution, particularly on academic matters. Restrictions on accreditation bodies, which ensure quality control and quality assurance for universities, because those bodies might include a DEI standard when they're doing that. So really a wholesale attack on university governance all around the country. In 2023, two of these bills became law, one in Florida and one in Texas. But this year, the floodgates have opened. In 2024, while there have been fewer higher education bills introduced, there have been many more that have become law or are about to become law. So far, new laws in Utah and Indiana, new laws in Florida, Alabama, and Wyoming seem likely to be passed within the next 2 weeks. They've cleared state legislatures and are likely to be signed into law. And a bill in Kentucky has at least a 50% chance of becoming law. And there are several other bills we're continuing to watch in other states. So these university governance restrictions have really escalated here in 2024. So that's the background. The question is, how do we stop it? How do we stop this government censorship of higher education? And we face a number of challenges in doing so. One of those challenges is the ability to coordinate between national organizations and state organizations. We have, over time, built up the capacity and the coalitions around national voices to be able to speak when these bills are introduced at the state level. What we do not always know is when it is the right time to speak. It's only with that local knowledge, with people who are working actively in the state legislature, who can tell you when a bill might be on the verge of being amended or bottled up in a committee, and if you make a lot of noise about it, suddenly that bill will pass. So it's been very difficult to figure out how to activate these national coalitions effectively. We were able to do so on the bill that is going to become law in Florida earlier this year, only because several of the groups involved, including PEN America, had Florida affiliates that were actively involved in what was going on there. So the ability for national and state higher education groups to collaborate and coordinate is really going to be a key to stopping these bills. It's not that higher education doesn't have any infrastructure. It's that the infrastructure we have doesn't necessarily work very well on a state legislative level. Another key challenge, early alert and rapid response. It has continued to be difficult for us to find bills immediately after they're introduced, although PEN is building up our legislative tracking team so that we will have an ability to check more quickly. But what is really needed is to find out when these bills are going to be introduced before they're introduced, when it's easiest to stop them, when they're being drafted or when they're being considered before you ever see them appear on a state legislative website. And similarly, being able to respond quickly, very, very quickly, within a matter of days or even hours when a bill is introduced with overwhelming response, to make it clear to lawmakers in that state that these bills are going to be a real fight if they want to get them through. Another challenge is raising the salience of the issue. It may surprise you to learn that polls show that every aspect of what is being restricted in higher education, the restrictions are unpopular. This ranges from restrictions on teaching honest history, which is 75% of Americans think that's a bad idea, including large majorities of Republicans. To even DEI offices. If you poll, it turns out that when you poll people and ask them what they think of a DEI office on a college campus, even when you don't spell out the acronym, you still get majority support saying that it's a good idea. So it's not that this legislation is popular, it's that there is an asymmetry between those who support it, for whom it is their top issue, and those who support higher education who have many other priorities. We need to convince people who already support our position, the majority of Americans, that this is a matter of utmost significance for democracy. And raising that salience, putting our voices everywhere on this, making ourselves be heard all over the country in every venue, that's going to make a significant difference. And finally, achieving unity in a divided sector. Higher education is notorious for being very difficult to get people to work together. We're always arguing with each other. That's what we are. We're scholars. And I think it's hard for people to wrap their brains around the idea that in this crisis, everyone's natural interests are aligned within higher education. It is in no one's interest, whether it's your president, your board, your provost, or your faculty, students, or alumni. It's in no one's interest for the government to tell universities how to do their business or tell teachers how to teach. And so being able to work across these divisions within higher education is another significant way that we can meet these challenges. So my final slide here, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues. What can you do? So for educators, our main advice is don't do the censor's work for them. These laws are vague. They rarely ban specific practices. Don't fail to do something unless the law or someone at your institution is telling you cannot do it. Overcompliance is the villain here. It is the way that these laws work. We're not asking anyone to break the law, but we are encouraging people to observe its letter and not to avoid talking about anything that could potentially be viewed as a violation of the law. We support each other, support faculty, staff, and students, defend your mission and your disciplinary standards and the mission of your institution, as well as of your discipline, which in many cases includes work on diversity as part of the mission. Higher education constituents are citizens too, and they are citizens who have generally good storytelling ability. Tell the story of higher education and democracy. Write op-eds, letters to the editor, talk to your family and friends, even if you're in a place where you can't do that publicly. You can still do it in a private setting. We have found through polling that the most convincing arguments here are that the legislation has a chilling effect on free speech in the classroom. Nobody wants teachers and students muzzled in the classroom. And especially even more stronger than this, nobody wants the government telling teachers what they can and cannot teach. Finally, for those of you who are higher education professionals, do not go it alone. This legislation is isolating. It makes you feel as though you are the only person fighting against a sea of censorship and a sea of opposition. But the reality is there is an army of us out here all around the country, including in very difficult terrain. I should clarify, I was a professor for 4 years in rural Utah. I don't underestimate the difficulties that people face in various parts of the country. What we need, as I said, is whole sector solidarity within higher education institutions and collective action across institutions and sectors. Everyone should be working together as closely as possible, in as much collaboration as possible to stop this legislation. And then I do think we can turn the tide. So that's my bit. I've gone just a little bit over. Appreciate your time. And of course, I'll be around for questions after our excellent colleagues weigh in next. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeremy. Janella.
Okay. Thank you, Jeremy. Hello, everybody. Attacks on CRT and DEI are not simply attacks on two components of higher education. They are attacks on academic freedom and institutional autonomy. To the public, the CRT dog whistle signals book banning, dismantling of research and academic departments and programs studying race, gender, and ethnicity, disrupting and ending scholarly research and teaching on problematic history, literature, and science. These are all academic endeavors approved by faculty and expected to be protected by academic freedom. The DEI dog whistle, while appearing to focus on outlawing and dismantling diversity initiatives, signals the dismantling of university governance, expected to be protected by institutional autonomy, as Jeremy has detailed. Whether you support, question, or oppose women's and gender studies, ethnic studies, inclusive literature and history, or diversity efforts is beside the point. At stake are the faculty's right to academic freedom and the ability of institutions to organize as they see fit. Discussions of court decisions in AAUP's Academic Freedom and Law reveal room for much debate about free speech protection in academia. As for academic freedom, there are restrictive caveats in addition to state laws that question aspects of academic freedom, despite Justice Frankfurter's 1957 affirmation that academic freedom is protected by the Constitution. Justice Frankfurter outlined 4 essential freedoms of a university, quote, to determine for itself on academic grounds who may teach, what may be taught, how it shall be taught, and who may be admitted to study. In a 1967 decision, the Supreme Court is quoted as holding, quote, our nation is deeply committed to safeguarding academic freedom, which is of transcendent value to all of us and not merely to the teachers concerned. That freedom is therefore a special concern of the First Amendment, which does not tolerate laws that cast a pall of orthodoxy over the classroom, end quote. The AAUP Florida report identifies numerous egregious violations of academic freedom and institutional autonomy. However, evidently, state law reigns. Despite subsequent, possibly limiting rulings and the propensity of the current Supreme Court to ignore precedent, the ACLU and other legal organizations might be able to succeed in maintaining the constitutional right to academic freedom. It will be a tough battle. Academics and administrators, we must win the battle for public opinion. Here's a brief insight into the lay of the land. Last week, Black Republican Burgess Owens, Utah, chair of the subcommittee on higher education and workforce development hearing on DEI, called DEI a long-growing cancer that resides in the hearts of American academic institutions. Others claim DEI, quote, sorts identity groups based on physical characteristics and historical privilege, creating a system that it's the oppressors against the oppressors, the oppressors against the oppressed. Owens at one point stated, DEI teaches at the very top of the oppressor pyramid is the Jewish race. There is no empathy in the DEI space. Once identified as an oppressor, only disdain. End quote. 3 themes dominated the hearing. Republican lawmakers and witnesses argued that campus DEI professionals had failed to support Jewish students. 2, witnesses disagreed on whether DEI efforts are a waste of time and money. 3, debate ensued over whether DEI efforts that had helped or harmed Black students. Owens further argued that DEI excludes white, straight, male Christians and Black conservatives. Claims by the few Democrats there that DEI meets, quote, the needs of increasingly diverse populations, many of whom are first-generation college students, such claims paled in the context of unsupported, negative, and outrageous claims about DEI. Charge language like dictate, DEI orthodoxy, and claims that there must be, quote, fealty to vague and ever-expanding demands and to the people who enforce them, end quote. All and more are in John Saylor's February article, How the New Racism Took Over Our Colleges. Such rhetoric we have seen can incite Americans who feel left out economically, politically, and socially to perceive colleges and universities as their interest, as against their interest, and sets up the rationale that there is a country to take back, to recall Pat Buchanan's 1992 rallying cry. So what can be done? As one of the recipients of grants to advance U.S. pluralism in the curriculum for a book on American ethnic studies to explore race and ethnicity in American studies, and as a participant in a grant advancing the future of minority studies and graduate students, my first question has been, where are and what can foundations do? The second is, what can faculty and administrators do? Sean Harper, in a January Forbes article, made it easy for me, for he argues convincingly that money is needed to stop the well-funded anti-DEI movement, and that, quote, philanthropic support will help save our democracy from one of its biggest, most unnecessary threats. Harper provides 5 ways foundations can respond. 1, leverage influence to help people understand why DEI is essential. The goal, disrupt misinformation and disinformation. Here, I suggest people include faculty, administrators, accreditors, politicians, and the general public. We can't assume everyone understands the details when they're attacked. 2, unite previous and current grantees to, as Sean says, easily furnish evidence that disproves the lies exaggerators are effectively spreading. 3, invest in DEI defense efforts. Help organizations that are actively fighting back against politicized efforts to dismantle DEI. The work that the rigorous foundation vetting processes previously deemed worthy of investment, and they spent lots of money on. 4, adapt rapid emergency funding processes. This is an emergency. 5, join with other foundations to collectively respond. What can faculty and administrators do? Here are some possibilities, and I hope in our discussion we can come up with many more. 1, work with one another to identify, discuss, and respond to ways attacks threaten academic freedom and institutional autonomy at your own specific institution. 2, partner with DEI student life offices or advocates to improve ways of ensuring success for all students of all backgrounds. Become more involved in those efforts. 3, partner with DEI advocates to identify and correct problems in the delivery of DEI initiatives at your institution. 4, as citizens, along the lines of what Jeremy is proposing, work with community groups, school boards, library groups to explain what CRT is and how it is used as a dog whistle against a multiracial democracy, how DEI is intended as a corrective. Presidents can begin by ensuring that they, their staff, and their boards are informed about what CRT and DEI actually are on their campuses, distinguishing from the exaggeration and distortions and mistakes. UC Riverside Stephen Brent, in a March 6 Chronicle essay, If Trump Wins, provides an extensive review of the planned overhaul of higher education should Trump win. He demonstrates that higher education leaders are unready for the onslaught and identifies key areas of attacks and response. I recommend his article as a primer for faculty and administrative action. Finally, we need to consider the role of identity politics. We need to reconsider the role of identity politics. In an October 2023 Chronicle article, Jason Blakely traces identity politics not from postmodernism, but from nationalism in the 17th and 18th centuries, when, quote, identity becomes the site of a unique form of ideological rallying, end quote. Clarifying how, quote, the need for recognition in the face of non-recognition stimulates an effort to confirm one's place, end quote, he argues that identity politics is inescapable, that while its complexities can, quote, certainly form one of the most worrisome and fearful engines for political mobilization, it is also the source of much good. Identity politics is not a new phenomenon, and in our context, students form identity groups for recognition, belonging, and often for the confidence to engage with an institution. Blakely does not discuss the identity politics in the foundation of America, rooted in political recognition and non-recognition, white males as property owners and voters, white females as non-property owners and non-voters, indentured servants, slaves, Black men counted as 3/5 of a man, Jim Crow era restrictions that identify Black Americans as unequal, early restrictions on German immigrants as citizens, later on Italians and Jews, all based on identity politics. Here, identity is often recognized as unequal, identity politically and often culturally unequal, even inhuman. The roots of inequality in the United States rest in early, well-established identity politics. Critical race theory reveals the structures that perpetuate that inequality historically and contemporarily. As to inclusion, DEI must consider more carefully its context. At a previous institution, I secured funding for a Bridges to Pluralism all-college lecture series where topics on diversity were explored and discussed. White students suggested the idea to me because they wanted to know their role as the institution's demographics were changing. Surely, one said to me, students of color aren't the only ones who need a bridge program. We must recognize that our students mostly come from socially segregated communities, and colleges and universities are frequently the first place they encounter the difference. Likewise, socially segregated is the general population that we must convince of the worthiness of CRT, DEI, academic freedom, and institutional autonomy. Democracy's fragile center is not holding. Things are falling apart. Whether it can withstand the well-organized and well-funded existential attacks that distort efforts to ensure a healthy higher education and a healthy, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural American democracy is largely up to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Janella. Richard.
Thank you, Janella, and thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Brian and the Center for inviting me into this critical conversation, I should say. Well, let me build on Jeremy and Janella's fine presentations. And let me say this from the vantage point of somebody who spent 50 years in higher education, the last 17 as a college president. So I've seen the various divisions that Jeremy has talked about and the tensions and stresses that I think lots of administrative leaders feel at the moment. But I think the premise that I would start with and feel very strongly about is that we are facing really an unprecedented moment in higher education. And of course, in American democracy, it's to some degree, absent the Civil War, that there's an intentional, disclosed, affirmed attempt by the right to capture higher education and impose on it an authoritarian, nationalist, and theocratic orthodoxy. And essentially, it sees itself as a movement reinstalling racial patriarchy and racial and gender subordination. Let's not mistake it for something else. It's a full-on attack to academic freedom and the role of universities and the role of knowledge in our society. And so I think that we first have to know the extent of what we're facing. And with that, try to move in ways that make sense strategically and are sustainable, some of which have been outlined by Janella and by Jeremy. But I do think that we have to understand one thing, and I would say this to my fellow leaders in higher education, as well as faculty and students, that presidents and chancellors, to start there and move our way down, need to be patriots to the institutional mission which they have agreed to serve and promote. And that's one of pursuing truth and knowledge based on the anvil of putting them through the anvil of evidence and reason. That's where the patriotism comes from, clearly supporting the very nature of what the institution's about, and one in which you've sworn an oath to protect, defend, and expand. So I think we have to start with that premise and realize that we have a lot of work to do, and we are doing a decent amount of it, but much, much more to do in terms of confronting what is clearly an attack on democracy in its most fundamental way, and the autonomy of institutions of higher education, but mostly on the freedom to learn. And I'll start there. I think to fight back, we need to have ascribed to 5 or 6 major points. The first of all is to understand this is an attack on the freedom to learn, the freedom to teach, and the freedom to research. And I think we have to focus the conversation around that because Americans hate losing specific freedoms. If there's one thing that unites Americans, it's they don't like having liberty taken from them. They don't like freedoms abandoned. Witness the reactions in red states to the dissolution of Roe versus Wade and the loss of reproductive rights in those states, and the reaction through various voting movements to overcome that. So let's focus, first of all, that we need a clear, compelling, understandable message. And I think we should focus on the freedom to learn, expanded to the freedom to teach and research. That basic Americans have a right to pursue freedom to learn in their own way, and two, to reap the benefits of the freedom of learning. Second, I would argue that we need to organize the base. I think, as Jeremy alluded to, the disorganization, the fragmentation, some might say the elegance of all the various ways in which we teach and learn in the United States at the higher education level, from community colleges all the way to research ones and all the different things in between, HBCUs, Native American colleges, and so on and so forth. That elegance of the variety of differences in which and ways in which we present knowledge and truth and help students advance themselves in terms of learning and growing and discovering themselves and the world around them is our strength of us, but it's also politically a weakness, as Jeremy has alluded to. So the second thing we need to do is, after having a very clear, focused message, is to organize our own base. And that is hard, because we have fallen prone to the liabilities, I guess I would say, of the prestige model of higher education, where we somehow rank ourselves into some kind of hierarchy, starting with advanced research ones and all the way down to whoever we think is on the bottom. And we don't want to be in any group that's below us. And there's been so much attempt by higher education, whether it be US News or this or that, to segregate ourselves from others, that we've really lost politically any sense of real unity. So reunifying ourselves is absolutely critical. And I think it's essential for us to be successful in this movement of fighting for the sector and fighting for the freedom to learn. Thirdly, I would say, as Janelle had pointed to, and Jeremy had in his presentation, that we need to organize a multi-sector coalition. That's really important. And that coalition needs to start with K through 12 allies who are suffering a lot, as Jeremy alluded to, in the absolute censorship of what they are allowed to teach, what they're allowed to have in their classroom. The level of intimidation is really quite profound in K through 12. I spent a full week in Florida last year, when this was all just gaining traction, with teacher aides who were going to completing these were adults, mostly people of color, who are getting their bachelor's degrees completed through all kinds of programs with four-year institutions, so they can move from being teacher aides to teachers. And the stories they told, and their stories, by the way, their personal stories, were heroic in their own lives. The fact that they would move to a slightly higher position in the public school system in Florida, which is highly underpaid, but the level of intimidation of what they could even say about their own lives, never mind what they could teach or have on their shelves, was just overwhelming. And some of it's captured in a number of the reports that Jeremy has alluded to, and that PEN America so elegantly has put out. So I would start the multi-sector coalition with K through 12 allies. And then I would use the model that was successful in the attempt to fight back for affirmative action in all the legal battles, where higher education was able to form coalitions with the military, who certainly understood the essential nature and importance of diversity education in a diverse army and military response. So the military became very pro-advocates of affirmative action, as did the corporate world. And to build on Janelle's point, there are not many places in the United States where we find interculturalism, intercultural experience. Our schools are segregated K through 12, our churches are segregated, our residential neighborhoods are segregated. Four-year residential institutions, the corporate world, and the business world generally, and the military are some of the places in which the races mix together and the classes mix together. And so they understand inherently the need for unity, understanding, and collaboration amongst the people who work and live there. So K through 12, the military, the corporate world, and all, of course, the gamut of higher education organizations and associations nationally that represent students, represent unions, represent leadership, academic leadership, and I would extend it even to our alumni associations that are potentially rich with allies who remember the freedom to learn and grow, and various professors they've had who've been so important. And faculty play a key role as well. So that the third point, the first being freedom to learn, a compelling and simple message. The second being organizing our own base. The third being organizing a multi-sector coalition. Third, and this I think is so clearly important to me, is to speak directly to the general public, to have our message understood clearly, not to be understood as representing our own self-interest as academics and as members of campus communities, but rather demonstrate in very specific examples why censorship hurts all Americans, and particularly non-college educated Americans, by pointing out specific examples of how the pursuit of academic freedom has led to all kinds of advances in their own personal lives. And a little piece that I wrote as an op-ed, I spoke to the way in which there were attempts by religious organizations to stop stem cell research, which was unsuccessful. And stem cell research has led to major advances in cancer, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, and stroke research and advancements in medicine. And in the social sciences, how we have many advances in job creation and health policy, understanding the relationship between brain science and learning, and so many other examples, how the freedom to learn and to research has advanced the lives of their children, their communities in very specific ways, and their own well-being. And even in the arts and humanities, the easiest to attack, so to speak, as being ideological from the right perspective. Just use this wonderful example. Probably the most successful Broadway musical in recent time was Hamilton. Well, Hamilton will clearly violate DEI standards in lots of the states that Jeremy pointed to. Yet Hamilton taught so many young people, as well as average Americans, what the American Revolution was about, what the structure of the government is, how it's organized, what its limitations are, and created a sense of interest in civics that has been absent from even the school systems for so many years. So the fifth point being to make the freedom to learn, the fourth point being to speak directly to the general public about why the freedom to learn is in their material, everyday self-interest in a concise, simple way with clear examples. So 4 points so far: freedom to learn as our basic talking point, organizing our own base, organizing a multi-sector coalition, speaking directly to the general public with clear examples. And finally, the last point I'll make is, in this work, given the moment that we're in, is to make the freedom to learn a national issue for the presidential campaign. Detaching it from any particular partisanship, but make it a general concern, a policy concern of utmost importance to the American public. And that in demonstrating again how censorship hurts everyday life, and secondly, how it's denying an essential right of Americans to pursue learning as they see it. I would recommend one thing in regard to this that I think everyone in the audience can have access to, and that's actually a documentary that PEN America had something to do with. In this year's Academy Awards, one of the documentary shorts that was nominated for the Academy Award is a film called Banned Books. And that is about banned books in Florida. And it's a short documentary. It's one you could show at various meetings. And all the speakers, for the most part, are the children in middle school who are specifically asking why this particular book or that particular book can't be taught, and why that book has meant something to them as they have pursued trying to understand learning themselves, the world around them. I think we'll face certain barriers to the work that we're doing. One, of course, is the obvious, the political intimidation of leadership in higher education through threatening budgets, threatening political appointments, and so on and so forth. What's the answer to that? Well, we've tried to do this in some of the work around PEN America called Champions of Higher Education, which is a group of retired or former presidents and chancellors of universities and colleges in the United States. And Jeremy tells me now that we have 250 signees of that document, many of us which are active in the kind of work that he was alluding to about writing and speaking and engaging legislation. We're in all 50 states, I think 3 territories as well. And so that's an important type of example of responding to the intimidation of higher education and leadership. I think faculty need to organize as they have been in certain places, but most importantly, students, again, around the notion they are losing freedoms, they are losing something that's their right. It was an incredibly important piece of overcoming the barrier of political intimidation. The second point I would make, I have 3 points on this challenge, is whether higher education should be nonpartisan in order to protect its autonomy. I know Brian's going to speak to this a little bit. We may disagree on this point. As I said, I think presidents and Leaders in higher education have to be partisan to the missions of their institutions. That's where the partisanship lies. But I think we can cast our work in this regard of fighting censorship as civic work and avoid the political designation that the role of higher education in defending itself and defending learning dates back to, none less than Franklin and Jefferson, and the notion that the civic mission of higher education was about, in part, about building and sustaining citizenship and democracy in their own limited vision of what that was at their moment in time and history, but clearly what it means to us today in building an intercultural, just democracy and a dynamic economy. I love at Portland State has this wonderful refrain that my friend, former president of Portland State, placed in its mission, and it actually hangs over the campus on a bridge. And she said at Portland State, at a critical time for their institution, trying to organize an institution that was somewhat dispersed in terms of its actual practice, couldn't find a center to what it was doing. She said simply, let knowledge serve the city. Well, I think our refrain should be, we are nonpartisan in the sense that we're civically organized, and we are letting knowledge serve the nation. And that's what the freedom to learn is all about. And finally, the last challenge or barrier I think we'll face in going forward is the media's phobia, not only with Donald Trump, but with the horse race, which is the only thing they know how to do. Is they don't cover policy, they cover horse races, and the horse race for the White House. We have to insert into that media mix somehow that making freedom to learn is a policy issue of the utmost importance. So in concluding, I would just say we have to get our own house in order. We have to keep the message simple and compelling, and we have to actively engage our allies. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I just have a few comments before then turning to the questions and comments that come in via the chat. I guess I do want to directly challenge the dichotomy, Richard, that you put up there between the civic and the political. Let me put it that way. While I agree with the line of march that was proposed by Jeremy, I think elegantly sketched out, Janella, in your direct appeal that people not divide the question of defense of DEI and CRT from the general attack on higher education. These are the same struggle. And Richard, your excellent advice that we need to speak to a broader audience to understand that this is not purely a self-interested, kind of let us keep our own house, stay away, we know what we're doing kind of argument. I can agree with those sort of general points and say three things. First, we are not going to change the national perception of the importance of this issue between now and November. I would stipulate that is not going to happen. Secondly, we will not raise the salience of it into a national role precisely because the media's obsession is with the horse race and not with substance. The third thing, however, is a direct, if you will, self-examination about the nature of the limits we impose on ourselves around nonpartisanship. Two things are true. Under state law and regulation, universities are bound to be nonpartisan, like nonprofits, and to avoid the expenditure of public monies to support a particular candidate or party. That's the case. Now, however, secondly, what if we do face an existential attack on the nature of our nonpartisan institutions? What analysis do we then do privately, secretly? What analysis do we do of the origins of that attack? And it seems to me both Janella and Jeremy have sketched pretty clearly where the attacks are coming from. How might we respond? It seems to me that one response, and it is a response that has been, I think, broadly characterizing higher education, is to sort of piss and moan about it just with ourselves, but not really act publicly in any kind of way. If I look, and Janella, I think the sad fact is both in Texas and in Florida, but even maybe oddly worse in Texas, Higher education responded officially as if they really could abandon DEI and just keep on. The University of Texas delivered these incredibly elaborate instructions on how to deconstruct your DEI efforts, as if the remaining institution would be just like it always was. Then there's efforts to just rename it. We'll call it something different and do it anyway, kind of response. Let's say that's what happens in states like Florida and Texas. And Jeremy, you're quite right. The anxiety of over-responding, if you will, self-censoring. But the response from higher education outside of the 14 states that you identify, Jeremy, has been silence, because of the fear that you too will then be in the crosshairs. Brent's article in the Chronicle suggests that none of us will be exempt from an attack on accreditation and self-governance. None of us. No research agendas will be safe from a dramatic recasting of the National Endowment's agendas, from the National Science Foundation agendas. No one will be safe. What then is an institution committed to nonpartisanship to do? I am struck by the fact that we are now in late spring. In the fall, universities across the country will spend millions of dollars hiring part-time and temporary staff to facilitate the football season. Ushers and security guards and parking attendants and special secret super, anything they need to think of in order to facilitate 11 games over the space of the fall season. What if universities examined the expenditure of staff to facilitate the political engagement of their students in national campaigns, even if your state isn't itself in the crosshairs? What if you encourage students not simply or only to vote, but to engage in the currencies of politics, money and time, resources and time? One could announce to students that they could do their own analysis of where they think their votes, their money, their time could help. Help in which of two ways? On the one hand, there is a national agenda all over the country. People are urging students to vote. The All-In Challenge, Fair Elections Network, there are national associations and organizations who are dedicated to staffing up the efforts of students to vote more. Let's take the state of California. Yes, it would be wonderful if students in California voted more. Terrific. Who could possibly oppose that? It is purely, to use your distinction, Richard, a civic agenda to encourage our students to vote more. Similarly, it would be exactly the same thing for students in Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Arizona, and Nevada to vote more. And every effort to encourage students to make their own choices, do their own analysis, vote for the candidates that they think will best serve their interests in those 7 states, which just happen to be the states which may determine the presidential election. That's a good thing. What if we also made it possible for alumni and students to make their own analysis of which candidates they think support the broader institutional mission of higher education? Which do they think are going to be the supporters of the long-term interests, let's say, of the University of California? So that if the alumni of the University of California were asked by the chancellors or the president of the institution to review where their energy, their money, and their time could be helpful to higher education, which candidates would they support? Which states would they help? If you think of something like Georgia Stand Up, a nonpartisan effort to get more Georgians to vote. All over the country, state by state, there are get out the vote efforts by both parties that make an effort to influence the end of those elections. Those of us in California, we can easily do what, in my view, we have mostly done, which is sit back, be really aggravated and moralistically annoyed at the people in Florida and Texas, and then stay back.
Yeah.
I don't think we can afford to do that anymore. And I had an exchange with a former chancellor around the question, well, what if the chancellors of the University of California wrote to the Alumni Association memberships to say, we believe the future of higher education is at stake. We wish you to do your own analysis of which candidates in which states are best going to support higher education. And here are some practical alternative places to donate money and time. Volunteers in the last election, we met one woman who was working in the sort of engaged voting space, had written 10,000 signed 10,000 postcards for Get Out the Vote in Georgia. I have no clue which party she was for and no clue which voters got those postcards. Those kind of activities, which are obviously organized in a partisan way, but also obviously organized in a nonpartisan way, could be very practical interventions. When I mentioned that possibility to my friend, his comment was, well, that's not his job. His job is to be concerned about the California legislature and the California politics, to which you can stipulate that by and large, we in California are not going to be affected by DEI bans in Florida. I got it. But to the degree to which we could respond much more aggressively to engage our students, our alumni, our faculty and staff, to see practical political steps they can take between now and November, is a way of making concrete what both of you, Jeremy and Richard, said, and what Janella, I thought, was the core of your comment, which this is actually a national crisis. This does actually affect all of us. So beyond saying that, what are the practical steps and the resources we could align? We would never have to use the names of political parties or specific candidates. Ask our people to make decisions based on their own analysis of what they thought would be best between now and November. Anyway, enough said. We have all kinds of questions here. I'm looking at some of them. We got a couple of questions in the very beginning. No, I'm getting ahead of myself. First, responses. Janella, Richard, Jeremy, any responses to each other? Follow on.
It's not really a response to each, in a sense it is, but someone has asked in the chat, how can an authentically racist rhetoric and draft legislation methodically crafted by a politician for the purpose of reversing multicultural human rights and the citizenship be identified as racist and resolved without debate? In other words, I think the person is asking, how can this be allowed that someone can solicit tax dollars to be used for this? And I think this points to an issue, Brian, that's part of the partisan, nonpartisan argument, et cetera, but also to the point that things have we have done so much by custom in this country, by the goodwill of people. You guys tell me, is there anything legally that could be done to stop this, say, Representative Owens that I quoted, who is doing what this person is asking in the chat? What legal recourse do we really have against politicians who advocate this way? Is it only voting them out? It seems to be that.
We are a free expression group, so we try not to advocate for censorship of people who say things that we strongly disagree with, including what Congressman Owens said. To me, the solution is to provide this is a misinformation issue. The solution is to provide better information and to target that information where it needs to go, to make it clear what DEI is and is not, to make it clear what these laws will do to higher education, and to fight the laws themselves when they become law, fight them before they become law in state legislatures, and then fight them after they become law in the courts. So I don't think we can silence this movement, nor should we try to, but I do think that we can counteract it effectively in a variety of ways.
This is Richard. I would just say, Janella, that I think the third rail here for the right orthodoxy is going to be probably residually after the campaign is the student response to be, and I'm starting with middle school kids and as they mature into their adolescence, into college years, being denied the right to learn. I think that is the explosive issue that I think we have to think about how we deal with that. I don't mean in terms of confirming any kind of right-wing conspiracy notions that we're going to brainwash them. No, they're going to come to understand their own self-interest and what they value and don't value. And this is a generation that looks for solutions, at least trying to look for solutions. So I think we need to talk about ways in which we can speak directly to our own students on our campuses about their rights, their right to learn.
Would you include, you're over in New York, I'm in California, Janella's in Atlanta. These are some different settings in which one would speak to those students.
How do you talk to those other folks? Look,
Yeah,
I spent 22 years.
Should anybody be spending the time talking to California students when this isn't a California issue? It's not going to happen here.
Absolutely. First of all, I spent a lot of my career in New York State, not just in New York City. In New York City, I spent 22 years on Staten Island, which is not exactly a liberal bastion of ideas, and dealing with a lot of white working class constituencies, as well as many constituencies of color and difference. And it's important, I think, right there. Never mind, I spent 19 years in upstate New York in a rural area that has never had a Democratic congressperson represent it. So I think it's important, even in so-called blue states and liberal states, is to realize that within us are also these wells of difference, and we have to learn how to speak to them of reaction. And I think it's really important, and I think we both encounter the same thing, Brian. And I don't know if Janelle is getting this experience in the parts of Georgia which she's in. The sort of saying it's not happening here. It can't happen here argument. We're liberal New York, we're liberal California. Well, as I think you very tellingly said, Brian, it's coming through accreditation. It's coming through the capture of accreditation processes that are going to, and then Chris Rufo has been very clear about this. This objective is to take over accreditation and form it into a wedge for right-wing thought.
So it's coming everywhere. Tax dollars are being used. I want to get back to that. I'm not advocating censorship at all, Jeremy, but I am what I would like to advocate or to emphasize the need of foundations to provide money to help fight, to help get the misinformation addressed, the disinformation addressed, to do all the things that we're talking about. We need tremendous help to do this. We don't have a Cato Institute. We don't have an American Enterprise Institute. We don't have a Heritage Foundation, okay, that's funding all of this. And so that's encouraging tax dollars to be used this way. So how do we let people know, and how do we put this campaign? I like Richard's idea of freedom to learn. Okay, we need a slogan. We need money. We need to train people to talk well about these issues. So that's my big push here, is for my big cry for help is from foundations to really do what they to build on what they began in the 90s and did very well in the 90s into the early 2000s.
Can I say one other thing that might be controversial? And Janelle, I want to speak to your point about identity politics, because I've rethought a lot of my own issues here and fear some of the limitations on a strategic point of identity politics, and read all the recent critiques on the left of identity politics. And I think you make a telling point about identity and indivisibility, and every time we sort of uncover a history and the subordinated kind of rise to a moment where they have standing, of course, they're pushed back down. That's our history. We know that well. So I kind of come to the position, and it's to this larger point, that identity politics are the necessary but not sufficient condition to building an intercultural democratic movement. You cannot move without first identifying and understanding and bringing to the surface a clear understanding of our history and past in all its manifestations. I think I've come to this position, but we also need to then focus on the other part, sort of the mountaintop part, which is, what are we building? And we're trying to ultimately get to a point where we're building an intercultural, just democracy. And but identity politics gets us part of the way there. Then the point of is to have those various groups turn to one another and learn from one another about our respective histories and legacies in a way that begins to pull us together, understanding the differences and historical differences and different standings that we have today, but in the notion that we're building something which is more just, that there's a place we're going to that's good and better for everyone in one way or another. Because I fear that just identity politics by itself, and this is the right wing, this is where they divide us, is to say, oh, the gain of some people is the loss to others. And we have to have a vision of a democracy which is a gain for everyone, that it's a positive sum gain. It'll take places in different ways, but I fear we're losing constituencies because we don't give them a place in a larger world, in a place that's fair and just. I don't mean preserve privilege. But I think that's part of the conversation I think we need to have as well. Not for this particular movement. That's a larger conversation for us to have as we grow from our own moment here.
I do think part of our difficulty is that the terms of democracy have themselves now been contested. I would not be surprised if the far-right faction of the Supreme Court agreed that only white landowners should have the vote. That's an originalist position, for Christ's sake. I think the scary thing, I'm recalling that in the late 80s, the California State Legislature adopted as the title of its review of the Master Plan for Higher Education, Education for Multicultural Democracy. It was unanimously adopted by the Joint Committee. It was adopted by both houses of the legislature with only 2 negative votes. I cannot imagine that vote happening without it dividing politically right now. So that something that seemed, if you will, commonsensical, given the demography of our state, if we are committed to democracy, it will by definition be a multicultural democracy, or else it won't be a democracy, is now contested terrain. So in a circumstance where democracy itself is contested, Jeremy, you could cross-reference the attacks on voting against the map that you put up for attacks on higher ed, and it would be isometric.
Yeah.
It would be essentially the same, except the attacks on voting, it would be far larger. There'd be more states in that deep color that indicated stuff had already passed. I think 37 states have had restrictive voting pass of some form or another. And I do think that if democracy is at stake, it is a responsibility of higher education, faculty, leadership, alumni, staff, to be talking about it with our constituency, with our students, and not hide behind it can't happen here because it's not happened yet here.
And Brian, I think we have to draw that connection that you just made between the attacks on voting, the attacks on election integrity, and the attacks on higher education, because that's what's missing. You can see this in voting patterns. Politicians pay a price for attacking free and fair elections. They don't always lose, but you can look at how their vote totals compare with the vote totals of their partisan identification or other races in the state, and there's a clear penalty to be paid for making those arguments. We don't see that penalty being paid for attacking higher education. And I think that's a line that's something that we have to convince people of, that we have to help Americans understand that higher education is a training ground for democracy, that it is a way that we train our democratic citizens to understand the world around them when they are voters and leaders, and that if we are undermining their access to knowledge and their freedom to learn in that setting, we are creating a serious problem for our democracy now and far into the future. One other point I wanted to address that came in through a question. Someone asked about, isn't it false that it's not in presidents' interest to allow legislatures to encroach on university autonomy when presidents are appointed to do the bidding of legislatures? It's an interesting question. I would say, I have spent a lot of time with a lot of both current and former college presidents in the last couple of years. I haven't met many people in those roles who enjoy being a figurehead whose day-to-day work is dictated for them by politicians. That doesn't mean they don't necessarily agree with the politicians. Think about Ben Sasse, for instance, in Florida. Ben Sasse probably agrees with Ron DeSantis on a lot of issues. He may agree with him on higher education policy more broadly, but he didn't resign from the Senate so that he could be an empty suit and have Ron DeSantis or the Florida legislature tell him what to do on a daily basis. I don't think anybody in a university, with rare exceptions, wants to play that role. And so I do think that it may not be that they disagree with the legislature, but they do not want the legislature telling them what they can and cannot do, even if they may agree with the legislature on a variety of issues. That's my take anyway.
What
yeah.
you've however also identified, Jeremy, is what we might call anticipatory anxiety. That very often, out of the fear that the legislature is going to tell them to do X, Y, and Z, they will, by golly, do X, Y, and Z. And of course, if you're in a state where this legislation has not been introduced or doesn't have a faint chance of passing, you can enjoy the privilege that comes from not having to face those kinds of choices. What I was trying to suggest is that I think we should face them anyway, and see if there are ways of engaging our students, our faculty, our staff, and critically our alumni. See if we can actually engage them invite them to politics. Let me put it that way. What do they believe is going to make a difference? And then here are the 7 swing states. I just said those sentences without reference to any political party. Make your own assessment, make your own judgment. But the lack of even asking is a form of retreat.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to your point, though, Brian, reaffirm something I said earlier. Let me give a visual. Most every president is inaugurated. Every college, university chancellor, and president, they put their hand on a Bible or something like that and say, "I take an oath to defend the mission of this institution in one way or another." That's what they say, and that's what I mean by becoming patriots and partisans to the mission. And I think that's where we have to start the conversation with them. Are you serving us? And to your other point, I don't think I much affirm Jeremy's point about presidents not genuflecting to the legislature as their only act, because presidents don't survive long when they have campus turmoil, whether they have the favor of the legislature or not. They don't survive long when they have faculty turmoil, student turmoil, alumni turmoil, and so on, parent turmoil, and all the rest of it, local community conflicts. They have so many other constituencies that are maybe they're not as powerful as the legislature, but they certainly have influence and can create tremendous consternation and ultimately shorten the length of any presidential term.
I do think the responsibility, however, lies with a lot of other players. Not simply, you weren't suggesting it was uniquely chancellors or presidents, but there are staff at every university with which I am familiar. There are staff at every college that are devoted to student life and student engagement and student action. The typical focus has been on student voting. As I said, who could possibly oppose that? That's fantastic. That's terrific. But asking students, let's say just with students, to think of themselves as national actors, think of themselves as having responsibilities, and then ask, what are the different ways you can get engaged? If that's all you do, you leave them with the Google search. One could also give them actual alternatives. And you can do that with all of the political parties. They can choose to support whomever they choose to support. I'm obviously saying that because I do believe that the issues of freedom to learn matter to students. They matter to families, but they don't particularly see a connection between that mattering or caring and a practical political thing they can do that would affect a national scene or a national election. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying it would be a challenge for university leadership to sit in a room and say, if we wanted to facilitate the engagement of our constituencies, how do we do that? Not how do we avoid it? We do have some questions from There's one about why is nobody pointing to the role played by organizations funded by dark money? I'm not sure how dark it is, but Jeremy, the whole question of who's funding these efforts, who's producing the templates.
It's an interesting question. I don't think it's as devious or as secretive as people often do. Sometimes a reporter will ask me this question: where's the money coming from? Who's funding this? Are these people? Is there some secret network of people working on this? And my answer is usually there's no secret network of people working on this. There's a very public network of people working on this. There are it's being run, generally speaking, out of the major conservative think tanks, the Heritage Foundation, the Manhattan Institute, where Chris Rufo is located, the Goldwater Institute, the Ethics and Public Policy Foundation, the National Association of Scholars. Those are the major players, and they're working. Oh, and the Claremont Institute in some cases. They are working together, or they are referencing each other's work, reading each other's work. There are some ideas that are bubbling up from legislatures. You'll see in a bill. This happened, for instance, with the Don't Say Gay bill, which was first. There is no model, as far as I know. It was originally introduced as a real bill in Florida, which became law, and then copied in other legislatures. Really, the tendency, in my view, to see this as a sort of secretive cabal that is behind this is an underestimation of how many people there are out there who simply have similar bad ideas about higher education, about race, gender, and identity. And so, you see some uniformity because they talk to each other and they borrow wording from each other. But ultimately, there are just a lot of people out there who think the best use of their time is to make life miserable for anyone who wants to educate people in a college classroom or in a college setting about the world around them and the people around them. And so, yes, whoever's funding the Manhattan Institute, whoever's funding these other think tanks, they're contributing to this, but I don't think it's being pushed primarily by money to operatives. Chris Rufo certainly makes a good salary, but I don't think he's making millions of dollars either. So that's my take. I think everyone is just a lot of people talking to each other, as frankly those of us who are trying to combat this legislation are also talking to each other and convening regularly and traveling to conferences and sharing language. So it's not that there's nothing really shocking going on. The shocking part is what they're saying and doing and thinking. And what they're doing right out there in public. You can go read Chris Rufo's Twitter feed, although I can't because he's blocked me. But you can go out and read his Twitter feed, and you can see everything they're planning right there laid out plain as day.
I think there is something shocking going on, though, and that is that we have in the House of Representatives a hearing that I responded to. We have things happening at the higher levels of government that are supporting racist, homophobic, all sorts of behavior. So that's the thing that shocks me. That's why I say that we can't, as faculty, when I urge faculty to organize and help and teach one another and learn as much as they can, we can't focus on our areas of interest or the problems that arise. When you begin this discussion, someone has here, which is a very good question. How do we, if we agree that if panelists agree that you can be a racist, then how can we clearly require that a racist cannot serve in the government? We can't do that. We shouldn't get caught up on those questions. We must keep focused on academic freedom being denied, keep focused on institutional autonomy being denied, so that we can figure out all these other questions, because we can't get to these other questions if we don't have academic freedom and institutional autonomy.
I've two things, Janella. The first, I read that comment as well. The way you respond to a racist trying to be in government is defeat them. I mean, that's what we
expose them and
exactly
defeat.
Oppose them and defeat them. The second thing is, I think that in an earlier exchange you and I had months ago, we said it with some humor, but it's not funny. We know that the people who have made an effort to ban CRT have never read a single book on critical race theory. The question is, how much do we know? One of the questions that I think all of our allies need to ask ourselves, if I want to defend CRT and DEI because I perceive it to be a general attack on a multicultural democracy, can I educate myself more specifically about what critical race theory is so I don't get trapped in these kind of false dichotomies and false arguments? And I do think that the degree to which a lot of institutions segregate DEI, leave CRT aside for a moment, because fairly arcane legal theory in law schools, but a lot of faculty and staff see DEI as something that happens over there. In student services, somebody takes care of that. I'm glad they do, cool. But the degree to which we see it as our work and therefore can defend it more substantively is a separate question.
Right.
And I thought that you made that point powerfully earlier. Let me see about, I've got from the audience. Defending freedom to learn, teach, and research shouldn't be only the sole responsibility of higher ed, foundations, or alumni. What's your opinion on engaging corporate America? Richard, that's a point you made. Jeremy, have you found corporate America to be interested in weighing in on these issues?
We're still working on this. We are working on a statement that we're hoping to reach out to corporate leaders to sign. It's going through external edits right now. We want to get it right because we understand that for corporate leaders, signing a sign-on statement is a very fraught endeavor. There's a lot of money on the line. It's tough enough to. We did a successful sign-on statement as Richard and Brian know with retired college presidents. That's a lot different, right? These are folks who are not, if you say the wrong thing, you're not going to cost your school $50 million in legislation. And if you're the head of Disney or the head of, Goldman Sachs, it could be a lot more than $50 million. It could be, hundreds of millions. So we want to make sure the wording is exactly right. We've been very slow and deliberate on this so that we can get it right. But we are working on it, and it is at this point the most common suggestion that we get, and it is I think the next place to go.
But clearly, the corporate world understands that they want to protect judiciously the prerogative to pursue profit. That's something they understand very innately. Of course, they don't want to jeopardize that. On the other hand, as you're saying, by being overregulated or being subject to a campaign, as was with the beer company and this one and that one. But Disney, I think, is a good example of kind of how this all is playing out. It's complicated, right, in Florida, because Disney fought back hard, and now they're faced all kinds of immediate kind of challenges on their tax status and the sale of property around them and the like. But I think at the end of the day, they realize that they either strategize that the political forces are temporary around them. That is to say, people lose elections or don't run for office again and they go away. Issues disappear for a while. Or they think that, in fact, they have to fight this in a more subtle way. But clearly, they don't want their prerogatives to disappear.
Yeah, I think that so a wonderful colleague at University of Southern California, Manuel Pastor, who has done really elegant analysis of the demographic transition through which the country is moving, that we will be a majority non-white country by 2042, March 15th, I believe. And that's inexorable and real. And it is the fundamental demographic reality of the country.
Yeah.
And so if you're marketing to that, you're thinking about that.
Yeah.
And you're not demonizing it. You're saying to yourself,
yeah,
that's who the market is. The degree to which the 30%, Jeremy, who think there should be political intervention, each of the large numbers that showed the plurality of support we have has as its companion that smaller number of people who are zealous in their effort to impose what Richard described as a kind of theocratic patriarchy. It's a really serious, long-term historic struggle. And so if we are going to prevail, it's because we will energize enough of the plurality of people who in opinion polls support the independence and freedom of institutions to actually act politically, not on our behalf, but on their behalf, on our collective behalf. On that cheery note, I want to thank everyone for being here. I believe we are a minute away from our time. Thank you for all of those of you who signed in. Thank you for those who sent questions. And thank you to Jeremy, Richard, and Janella for a good conversation. The Center for Studies in Higher Education will publicize its next in these conversations on academic freedom. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great.